Here we are. Welcome to the third Rome Dialogue promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are happy, very happy, to have with us Parag Khanna, a global Indian, as you define yourself, often being born in India, but grown up in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and then moved to New York, Germany, United States, UK, now Singapore, the world. A global Indian who is one of the world's most known futurists, a leading strategy advisor, and good for you, a best-selling author on Asia and the future of world order. Parag, starting from Asia, we will then dig into deep into the MENA region, looking at it from east, with a slightly different perspective to the one we are used to very often in Europe. Let me start on the pandemic. How come the COVID-19 pandemic took most of us by surprise, despite futurists like you predicting such events so often?
Well, first of all, it's very, very nice to be with you. Thank you for hosting me. As you know, I have a lot of respect for the intellectual class and also for the Italian civil service and diplomatic ranks, who I've spent, a fair bit of time with over the years and learned a great deal from. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
You came at ISPI a few years ago. Yeah. You were still slightly less known than now, but you came for a presentation, and we are great.
And I wish that we were together in person, of course, with all of us. So let me give you, the view from Asia. Let's remember that if just one thing about this particular coronavirus were different, namely the transmission time, right, the incubation period, if it were 24 hours instead of 2 weeks, this would have been over, right? We would have been able to know and identify every person who was infected, quarantine, isolate, and to contain the virus. So because this particular strain that has spread has had this 2-week incubation period, we have the exponential effect that it has had. And of course, because it began in China, in a crowded city, a city from which people emanated in all directions, all across to the Middle East, to Europe, to the United States, and so forth, during that 2-week, 3-week period. And only then did public health authorities begin to try to understand and unravel and untangle and reverse engineer. It took a long time. And for many, many countries, of course, including Italy and the United States, it was already too late. So in that sense, there is that's the narrow explanation of what went wrong. And then the deeper explanation in terms of the lack of preparedness, the inability of political forces to align, to take the virus seriously and to act vigorously against it, that story we also know is a failure. Because, of course, there were many warnings. We've seen that countries that do not trust their experts, whether it's environmental experts or epidemiological experts and so forth, are going to wind up paying the price. And I'll just say that, one of the important lessons that has come out of this, from the Asian point of view, is that Asia's democracies are getting the positive attention that they deserve. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, also, of course, the Anglophone countries in the region like New Zealand, because they experienced the SARS epidemic in 2003. So they had no qualms about taking this seriously, right? They knew that this was going to be have a massive impact. But secondly, very professional governments that the people have a lot of trust in and faith in and respect for. And so now, instead of looking at Asia and seeing only China, people are starting to see that some of the world's top-ranked democracies are Asian countries, because they blend not only democratic transparency, but also a strong civil service. And I think that has got to be the most important global lesson from this pandemic, from a governance standpoint.
And of course, the country where you're staying, Singapore, is at the forefront of what you're saying in terms of efficient and qualified government. It's also a small country, so it's much easier to put in place what we are struggling all over the world to put in place. Parag, you wrote 3 books on the future of world order, and the most recent one is The Future is Asian. After the pandemic, will the future still be Asian? You answered in a sense with your previous reply, but can you elaborate on this?
There's no question that when you look at the 3 main regional centers of gravity in the world, North America, Europe, and Asia, Asia, of course, is recovering the fastest from the pandemic, even though it emerged from Asia. You have the growth rates, the demographic advantage, the strong governments, the willingness now to use technology, whether it is the contact tracing apps that were used to identify infected individuals, or now the immunity passports and procedures between countries to allow for the opening between economies to proceed faster. Asia is leading in all of these areas. The only economies that will grow at all in the year 2020 are, of course, Asian economies. And Asia is much more self-sufficient than people realize in terms of energy, manpower, industry, technology, capital, and so forth. Of course, we know most of the world's medical equipment, generic pharmaceuticals, all of these things are made in Asia. So long as Asia stays stable and it reopens incrementally, that means that Asia will continue to recover collectively as well. Now, it's not an easy path from here to there, let's be clear. India is going into a depression. They have certainly not fixed the virus situation domestically. A number of economies have certainly been hit hard, but they know the path out. They know how difficult it will be. They are willing to absorb the pain. They have suffered in the past, and they're willing to do what needs to be done. And I think that is psychologically very important, first of all. Also, again, when I say the future is Asian, let's remember that the present is Asian, right? Most of the human population is Asian. This is not a partisan issue. I'm an American, as you know. I've grown up in different parts of the world, but I am not saying the things that I say about Asia because I live in Asia, because I was born in Asia. I am a scholar. I'm an analyst. My job is to look at the numbers and the trends, right? I'm not making rhetorical commentary. We're talking about more than 50% of the human population lives in Asia. You can see the map behind me, right? And 50% of global GDP is here in Asia. So the world today, right now, is an Asian world. But it is not a unipolar world. It's not a Chinese hegemony. It is not East replacing West. I have argued for 15 years in every book I've ever written that we are entering or have entered a world that is multipolar, multi-regional, multi-civilizational. I've gone back just the other day for something I was writing to see that I wrote that in my first book. I was 28 years old. I'm still saying the same thing 15 years later. The world is multipolar, multi-regional, multi-civilizational. We have never, ever lived in such a distributed global system. So just because Asia is becoming more powerful, it does not mean that the West is declining. As you know, I'm such a strong believer in the European Union and Europe as an anchor of the global system. I do not believe that America is going to disappear. North America is by far the most stable continent in the world. So we have to get used to this global system and to think about what are the complementarities, what are the lessons that can be learned, what are the areas of cooperation between these 3 major centers of power, as well as, of course, other regions and continents like Africa and South America.
It doesn't look we are going in that direction necessarily. I mean, looking at each other and finding way to cooperate. But let's stay in Asia still for a while. You said that not only the future is Asian, but the present is Asian. and there are a lot of truth in your sentence. But what will the future of Asia be? Will it look like Europe 2 centuries ago, when the present at that time of the world was European? I mean, will the future of Asia, this huge continent, be marked by rivalries, war, nationalism, China versus India, China versus Japan, Taiwan, North Korea, and so on? What scenario should we expect in this huge region full of superpower? Because that's the point you stress in many of your interventions. It's not China, not only China.
Correct. Well, the majority of the geopolitical flashpoints and tensions and rivalries in the world today are in Asia, between Asian powers. So I do not argue that Asia will be peaceful in perpetuity. I argue that Asia is becoming an ever more interdependent system. And systems are very often violent. The European system was violent for 2,000 years until after 1945. So Asia is very likely to be a violent system. Just look at the tension between China and India right now. Yeah. But that friction is evidence of the growing interdependence because of trade, because of investment, because of infrastructural linkages, because of competition, and so on and so forth. So conflict is inherent in the system. But after you have conflict, you also have settlement, right? And that's what Europe learned over hundreds of years, is that each conflict is fought and then it becomes resolved. There can be new conflicts, but eventually you move in a certain direction. And the outstanding border disputes and tensions, whether it's the South China Sea or whether it is between India and China and so forth, many of these are pre-independence era, colonial era disputes that were not resolved because Asian countries were weak. They were focused on internal development and stability and nation building. And now, one by one, these conflicts must be solved. And sometimes they will be solved peacefully, through a treaty or agreement or a definition or agreement of a boundary. Others will be solved violently. But just because you have a conflict, maybe a war in the South China Sea over the Spratly Islands, maybe a war in Taiwan, God forbid one of these wars happens, right? But there's also an end to the war. Europe has been through all of these wars. The war eventually ends. And after the end of the war, you have a settlement. You have a new normal. And it becomes a normal that is not one that dates to colonial powers with no local involvement, but it becomes a new intra-Asian settlement, which is recognized by the modern contemporary governments. And that becomes the new baseline, and it's done. And we all hope that these conflicts are resolved peacefully. In the last 30 years, Asians have had these tensions, but there has not been a single major war in Asia, as you know. Now, that doesn't mean there will not be one, but when there is one, it does not invalidate any argument about Asia being a system. And the one critical difference is that I resist very strongly the analogies from Asia today to Europe of the past. If you want to understand Asia today or Asia tomorrow, you should look at Asia's past. We don't need Western analogies to explain 4,000 years of Asian history. In 4,000 years of Asian history, you have had the powerful civilizations that you just mentioned earlier, and they have almost always been in a multipolar pattern. No one Asian power has dominated the others, except for the Mongol Empire 700 years ago, right? So that was something of an anomaly, you might say. And it did not last very long. And of course, it was the Black Death that splintered the Mongol Empire. So let's remember...
But very seldom at the same time, in the 2000 year before, there were so many being powerful at the same time. So that's the key issue. In that sense, I fully take your point. We should not look at Asia with the European eyes, but we have European eyes. We are here. But at the same time, when tension had been strong in Europe was at the time in which, at the same time, France, Great Britain, Germany, or Spain were on the rise, which was very seldom the case in Asia. But I think you made a very good point on this. And by the way, that point that you made could have allowed us to move into the Middle East immediately. But I would like to stay on Asia with you for a while, because challenging the view of many, you several times stressed that the Belt and Road Initiative is not, as many believe, the China's gateway to dominate the world, but something like a win-win project for most of the countries involved, which, by the way, will dilute China's influence in these countries, the opposite of what people say. Could you elaborate on this subject? And let me also ask you, what will be the future of the Belt and Road project after the pandemic, with, let's say, a growing anti-Chinese feeling in so many countries in the world?
Absolutely, that's an excellent question. Let me first explain that empires go through certain life cycles. They expand their supply chains, they build up their currency reserves and trade surpluses through their mercantilist economic practices. They invest heavily to buy friendships, they form military alliances, they expand their infrastructure as a tool of influence. They may form alliances or have colonies abroad. But in order to maintain that status, they have to keep on investing in their colonies. And over time, of course, they build up those very same territories that wind up resisting them, and then they are rejected and pushed away, and they collapse. That is the imperial life cycle. And that applies to Great Britain. That applies to all European empires. If that were not the life cycle, then India would not be an independent country, would it? Right? You would have a linear pattern of hegemony for each empire in the world. But you don't have that. So China is experiencing this life cycle just like every other expansionist power, except in the case of Great Britain, it took 300 years. In the case of China, it's taking about 3 years, because you can see already what has happened in the last 3 years. The first Belt and Road Summit was in the year 2017. Here we are, it's 2020, and everyone hates China, right? So it's taken only 3 years for many countries to say, we don't want debt traps, we don't want imbalanced trade, we don't want Chinese workers doing all of the projects. We want more local job creation. We want more joint ventures. We want more technology transfer, right? And so on and so on and so on. And already China is on the back foot, right? And this is entirely predictable, because this is how the imperial life cycle works. And the difference, of course, is that, again, in the age of colonialism, when the map seemed to be unmarked, so to speak, we don't live in that world. We live in a world of democracies. We live in a world of transparency. We live in a world where everyone is scrutinizing every single action that China takes and re-regulating their economies to ensure that China cannot own them 100%. So on the one hand, Belt and Road is symbolic of infrastructure finance, which is desperately necessary. When you think about the 5 billion people who live on this map behind me, the post-colonial world, and the huge populations of Asia and the underdevelopment, right? Of course, there's a desperate need for modern infrastructure as a platform for growth. And many countries, the big and important countries like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan and others, are using, in fact, China's investment, Thailand as well, to actually bolster their growth and to pay down their debt and to be well-functioning and modernizing states. So the future of Belt and Road, in the sense of mutually beneficial infrastructural partnerships that are well selected and allow economies to diversify, to create jobs, to generate growth, to pay down the debt, that is the role model of what we have always wanted in terms of international development finance of the last 75 years. We want countries to follow this pattern, right? It's only surprising to us that it's China that's the lender, that's all. But China has come into a gap that the West abdicated, because the World Bank walked away from infrastructure finance in the 1960s just as these populations were growing. So the future of Belt and Road is much less important than the future of infrastructure finance and sustainable infrastructure finance. And I'm very glad to see that Europe has moved forward with the Asia Connectivity Initiative. I'm glad to see that Japan, the United States, Asian Development Bank, Australia, many countries are now saying that they also want to compete with China, compete with Belt and Road, and offer competitive terms, concessionary terms for lending and infrastructure finance. And this will dilute China's influence, because now you don't have to go only to China, because everyone has realized that there is an infrastructure arms race.
But you answered to the first question. One comment on the second. Will China be able and willing for sure, able, given the financial and economic situation, to move on as fast as they had in mind with the project?
Well, it's not necessarily clear how fast, China wanted to do certain things. The reason that Belt and Road exists at all is because China in the 2000s rapidly became the world's largest importer of commodities and exporter of finished goods, because we, the West, made it the factory floor of the world starting in the 1980s, also Japan and Korea and Taiwan. So suddenly China needed to diversify its supply chains, have more efficient corridors for importing fuel, and to reduce its dependence on the Straits of Malacca, which is the so-called Malacca trap in geopolitics. So Belt and Road, you might say, started off as a defensive and reactive response to the bottlenecks of China's geography. But then, of course, it became something more offensive, because China became such a huge, powerful economy with massive liquidity and an ability to influence the economies of all of its neighboring states, with which it became the largest trading partner. So again, think about the cycle: defensive to offensive to pushback, right? Now, China, of course, you're correct to point out, China is worried about its very high debt levels, its aging population. It's going into current account deficit now. Its trade surplus has shrunk considerably as a result also of some of its own measures to reduce tariffs and increase imports in order to, again, make friends and buy influence. And these countries now have more and more confidence to stand up to China. But China would like to multilateralize the costs and the execution. It simply wants to have the regulatory and security and supply chain certainty that it needs, given its global supply chain footprint. As you know, in my work, I tend to emphasize supply chains and connectivity, because these are not a realm distinct from geopolitics. The Roman Empire expanded through roads and infrastructure. Nothing has changed in the last 2,000 years in this regard.
I always make reference to the Roman Empire when I talk about the Belt and Road. But since you mentioned supply chain, let me ask you something on globalization after coronavirus. Because you recently said that the world economy will be increasingly regionalized, which is largely so already. What will more regionalization mean? And is it economically feasible after decades of globalization-prone development?
It's an excellent question. First of all, you're exactly right that the regionalism was already happening, and the coronavirus is going to accelerate that existing trend of regionalization. I point out that the U.S.-China trade war instigated a process whereby the U.S. is trading more bilaterally with Canada, $300 billion, with Mexico, $300 billion, and with China, only $270 billion. So North American regionalism.
The same is true for Europe.
Well, Europe is way ahead, right? Europe is 70% intra-European trade, and Asia is 60% regional trade. Now, that was before coronavirus. Now, if you think about it, even if you want to operate global supply chains right now, you can't, other than digital. You can't even travel regularly transcontinentally, and we don't know when that will happen. So by necessity, we will start to think about the leveraging the complementarities with our neighbors more. We'll have more sensible, pragmatic, intra-regional integration. Now, Asia was the only region pushing forward, very, very steadily with trade liberalization, and they continue to do that. Trans-Pacific Partnership, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and all of these other agreements. There's a long way to go for Asians to make the most of the resources that they have. As I said before, Asia has people, Asia has technology, Asia has industry, Asia has energy, Asia has capital. It has all of the ingredients for deeper integration, and now it will pursue them. And I think that that is in many ways a good thing, because of course it can create more jobs, it can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from global supply chains, it can lead to greater investments in efficiency of agriculture. There can be many benefits actually to this regional world. We should not close off globalization. And globalization is probably my middle name, so I'm not rejecting globalization. But there are some aspects of globalization that we should be happy to get rid of. We should not have to put oil onto tankers and sail them around the world. That's not good for our planet. We should be investing more in local energy, right? The same thing goes for food and for various other things. But we should be allowing global migration where it's useful. Global financial flows are obviously very essential. The most significant right now dimension or aspect of globalization is, of course, international finance and capital markets. If it were not for the IMF extending more than $1 trillion of credit, if it were not for the World Bank with $250 billion of global credit lines for emerging markets, if it were not for the global asset managers owning so much of the local sovereign debt of many, many countries, if it were not for countries opening their capital markets to draw in money to stabilize their currencies, the world would have fallen apart by now. The world would literally have fallen apart. So there is no end to globalization. You should never believe anyone who says so, of course. And international finance very much proves that. The flows of people that will return most certainly prove that. Trade there's still a huge amount of global trade, and it will continue to evolve in new areas and sectors. So I have a sort of punchline on this. I always say never ever worry about globalization. Only worry about whether you are well placed to take advantage of globalization, whether you are in it or out of it. But there's no need to worry about globalization's future. It will be just fine without you and without me.
No, that's a good point. Let's gradually move into the region which is behind you on the left side of the screen, the Gulf and the Middle East and the MENA region. You several times mentioned that you believe that the future of the MENA region is a prosperous Arab civilization with stable commercial center from Riyadh, Doha, Dubai to Beirut, Aqaba, and Baghdad. Looking at the current situation, it looks like a distant future for us. How to reach this new Arab order? And what about, you mentioned these cities, but what about the prosperous Arab civilization hub with Beirut, Damascus, Amman, and Cairo, for example?
For the last several years, some of the maps that I've produced, such as this one, and then ones that are specific to the sort of West Asian region, North Africa region, Levant region, have focused on showing what functional geography, connectivity between Arab cities could do to promote a collective renaissance of their economies, of their societies, to try to overcome the very artificial post-colonial boundaries between them. Obviously, that's not a path that these countries have pursued, but some kind of a resurrection of an Arab version of the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman geography, Arab sovereignty would be what the countries of the region should pursue. But right now, obviously, only the Gulf countries have the wealth to stabilize themselves, to keep themselves stable. And as you know, their money props up Iraq, it props up Lebanon, it props up Jordan, Egypt most significantly in terms of large countries. So there is a very large burden, obviously, resting on the shoulders of the Gulf countries, precisely at a time when oil prices are falling and will continue to fall and will stay low. So I think there is this moment of sobriety, a wake-up call that the region is not facing for the first time, obviously. This is the region that was, invaded by the U.S. 20 years ago. This is the region that has, suffered the Arab Spring and the huge waves of anti-government movements that are also happening today. And now you have low oil prices and you have climate change. So at some point, of course, the governments in the region have to wake up and undertake a collective strategy and maximize their human capital and their natural resources.
Point is that we don't know when this time will come. But it's interesting, looking at the Gulf behind you, it's clear that from the economic point of view, the interest and the attraction is from Asia. But politically and in terms of security, their strong interest, it looks the other side, to the MENA region and to the other countries. But let's move to another question. One of the other comments you make frequently is that this century will not be dominated by nation state, but by cities. And you mentioned in particular dynamic and entrepreneurial cities such as Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. What is, in your opinion, the advantage of a city-state, like Singapore, by the way, which is, will it be the same after the pandemic, which in some way has reinforced the power of the state?
Well, the deeper point is, in fact, that there's no great nation, no great empire, no superpower that does not have great cities. You can have thriving cities in failed states, but there's no successful state without successful cities. So my point is not to view city and state as opposing forces, but rather to point out that, that cities are the foundation of strength, either for themselves or for the nations to which they belong. And this is why when I write about China, I point out that, yes, it is a vertically integrated authoritarian state, but administratively, it has become a set of 24 mega city clusters. And the strength of China is been elevated on the back of these 24 mega city clusters. And China has consciously invested not in making Beijing the center and everyone else remain peasants and serfs, but rather to build up 24 enormous economic clusters with their own economic and commercial strategies, with huge connectivity, dense connectivity between them to enable mobility and gains from scale. Now, the United States is the great economy and continental scale power that it is, not just because of not because it is centralized, because of course it's a very federalized and devolved system. But America has 40 urban clusters, right, that are not self-sufficient, but that are large and dense, 40 of them, right? And that's what makes America, America, right? So no other country has that many distributed centers of urban clustering and huge economic scale, all 40 of them. Europe is something, similar, right, in the sense of having many great cities across several dozen countries, each of which is quite dense. So that's the pattern that we should be looking for. So I'm not creating an opposition. I'm saying, though, that a smart country is often guided by the policies that are most beneficial to its cities. When you have a situation like Brexit, where the interests of the city, the capital city, that represents half of GDP, are voted against by the provinces and rural populations, that obviously is not going to be good for the country. So what is bad for the city is probably bad for the country.
Which is quite common in Europe. I mean, you have also in other country a sort of contraposition of the rural feelings and the big cities approach and politics. Last week, we hosted a dialogue with Qassam Salameh, the former United Nations Special Representative for Libya. When asked about the involvement of China in the MENA region, Salameh answered, China is not interfering with the conflicts, but will be the country, the one to take advantage of them later, being at the forefront line for the reconstruction phase. Do you agree with him? And is this a good indicator of Chinese posture in the region?
Well, one of the reasons that in the Asia book, I emphasize that this region is West Asia, not the Middle East, right? The Middle East is not a meaningful term. It's just a historical and colonial artifact. The term Middle East is not a geographical term in any case. It's a referential term, seeing the world from London, but it's not a term in geography. In geography, and geographers do not use the term Middle East. We talk about West Asia, we talk about North Africa, and so forth. So we are talking about West Asia. And just to remind everyone, of course, West Asia and East Asia had deep relations in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, right? It's only with the arrival of colonialism that we saw Asia fracture as it has. So what is happening today is the revival of the Silk Roads, what in fact historians call Afro-Eurasia. So one of the things that I've emphasized is that as the US loses interest in West Asia as its occupations wind up, European colonial interest influence is obviously also faded in the region, but East Asia's rise obviously makes it very influential in West Asia, and that process began in the 1990s with the energy trade and goods trade between the regions. Now it has become arms deals, scientific transfers, financial investment, and also, of course, this post-reconstruction activity. So whether it's Syria, Iraq, or other countries, there's already very large contingents of Chinese and Indian business people whose companies are backed and supported by export credit agencies. They're willing to take the risk on projects in these risky markets. That's not something that our countries are willing to do right now. And again, it's not about power filling a vacuum. It's not about challenging Western hegemony. It's just opportunism.
And there are a few questions on some point you made at the beginning of our dialogue. Let's go with them. The first one is asking, how would you coordinate or organize cooperation of a multipolar, multi-regional, and multi-civilization world, the one you described? If this is not possible, we are moving toward a polarized world without multilateralism, which means the world disorder as opposed to the world order of your books. How would you reply to this?
Well, first of all, multilateralism has never actually governed the world. We have to be absolutely clear about that. Multilateralism is an attempt at coordination among as many countries as one can convene and coalesce behind certain common agendas. Multilateralism has been successful rhetorically and in terms of international law in some areas, and in terms of coordinated action in a few areas. But when you're talking about a multipolar landscape, what defines that landscape has nothing to do with the institutional framework. We would need an entirely new institutional framework if we wanted to achieve an action-oriented global governance that takes the resources and coordinates the resources of North America, Europe, and Asia towards common objectives like climate change or rebuilding failed states, or combating the pandemic and so forth. So as far as I'm concerned, we do not have a multilateral system that is befitting the new geopolitical landscape, right? So I think we have to just be clear about that, especially in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that we're celebrating this week. So it's fine to be multilateralist, but we must also be realistic at the same time. I support and endorse, and I've used this expression G3 very regularly around US, EU, China. We need a G3 agenda. We need to have the means to harness their resources and channel them, neutrally.
What about Russia in this picture?
Well, Russia is...
We on the Middle, talking about West Asia, I will not use the word Middle East anymore with you now. I mean, we have been debating in the last 2 years the role of Russia. And we have been discussing now for 40 minutes and the word Russia did not appear so far. And also in this G3 that you mentioned, Russia is not in the picture. Where would Russia end up with?
Well, global governance is about the supply of order. Russia is a supplier of oil and gas. It's not a supplier of order. It often plays a significant role in disorder, as we know, in certain geographies, but that does not make it a pillar of global governance. When we're defining global governance and talking about global governance, we often are talking about legitimacy, institutions, cooperation, collective agendas. We don't identify Russia with any of those things, which is why we haven't yet talked about Russia. But that doesn't mean that Russia is not important. In geopolitics, Russia is extraordinarily important. Russia always plays an outsized role in my books because I take a geographical perspective on everything. And therefore, how can you write about anything geographical without writing about Russia? So for me, Russia is absolutely pivotal in its own domain. But in many of the places where we, in a day-to-day way, view it as interfering and being a nuisance, that's exactly what it is. But it's not going to be a provider of order anywhere, really, other than its own, sort of immediate direction.
Should we have a Russian here from a Russian think tank? They would probably say that they brought order in Syria, that it's a different vision of order, maybe. But that's what they would reply to you.
It's quite a different vision of order. But again, the reason that is not important is because whether or not you are bringing order to Syria or bringing disorder to Syria does not change the fact that Syria is not important. Syria is not representative of the planet Earth. If we're talking about global governance, again, we're talking about the provision of public goods for the global system, right? Whether or not you are on the correct side or the wrong side of a proxy war in Syria is not representative of your role in global governance. Now, of course, and I am not saying that the West is holding up its end of the bargain. I'm not saying it's providing the right, I'm not saying it has a good strategy towards failed states. I served, as you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan as an advisor to the US Special Operations Forces. I am not proud of America's achievements in those countries, to say the least. So even if a Russian were here, it wouldn't make a difference. I'm not making a personal sort of biased judgment, right? I'm making an analysis with respect to a country's activities and whether those contribute to long-term order. And I don't think that one can objectively say that the Middle East, West Asia, is somehow a permanently more stable region because of the role of Russia there. So again, it's an irrelevant situation to the broader questions.
I mean, in Europe, given the migration and terrorism, many people may have a different view on the fact that Syria is not that important in global order. We have also very often described the failure in Syria as something which has contributed to disorder and also in Europe. But I take your point. Someone is asking you, you said the present is Asian. Personally, this is the question. I think we are still firmly in a period of American domination. And even China has understood this. And the new Silk Road are expressively aimed at Europe. What do you think about this perspective?
Well, of course, the new Silk Roads are fundamentally about the ties between Europe and Asia, and also Africa, let's not forget, and West Asian countries, because there's the maritime Silk Road and there's the terrestrial Silk Road. Both are very, very important. But as I said, the phrase that I used earlier was Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia is the term that historians use when they describe the 15th and 16th century trade networks that link together Europe, Africa, and Asia. So there's no doubt that the purpose of it is to link Europe and Asia. These are the two largest economic regions in the world. They represent the largest volume of trade between any two regions in the world. Europe trades a lot more with Asia than it does with America. And I think that that's something that, those of us like you and me who grew up in a transatlantic era sometimes forget that Asia is a lot more important for your future than the United States is from an economic standpoint. Now, I know that in Berlin, they understand this very, very well. I believe in Rome, you understand this. Otherwise, you would not have joined the Belt and Road Initiative as you did. But I think that in many people's psychology, we still lean on this idea that the transatlantic relationship is the bedrock of global order. But really, it's not. It is itself a great achievement and accomplishment that there is a NATO alliance, that there are strong relations between North America and Europe, generally speaking. The weakening of those ties, though, does go back 20 years. Iraq War and the opposition, the tensions over handling of the Middle East situation, obviously the trade disputes and divergence now in trade policy, the fact that during that time Europe has begun to reorient economically towards Asia, and of course now the election of Trump and so on and so forth, and the rifts, those are very palpable. And so the mere fact that Europe has been becoming more independent, speaking with its own voice, developing its own agenda and policies, is also part of the reason that we don't really live in an American-dominated world. So again, it's easy to believe, and there is this state of suspended animation. There is a mental and psychological inertia that afflicts many, many people, right? And again, as an American, I should be susceptible to this. However, I spend all of my time traveling, all over the world. And so the reality of what I see is not an American-dominated world. I see a world that's highly contested depending on wherever one is in terms of who is, which power is the most influential in a given country.
You mentioned Europe. You mentioned that Europe has strong economic ties with Asia, stronger economic ties with Asia, and is gaining some independence from the transatlantic relation. But it's clear that should the rift between China and the United States go on, and I think it will go on for some time, it's clear that for Europe that will be an uneasy situation, because politically we have and culturally we have stronger ties with the United States and North America. Economically and looking at the future, we should turn toward Asia, and we could end up stuck in the middle between these two big powers. What would you, as an advisor, would you recommend to Europe?
Well, remember that again, just to go back to geography, the way to understand the US-China tension is not actually as an Atlantic issue where Europe is stuck in the middle. This is a Pacific issue. You are completely on the margins geographically of the US-China dispute. It's a dispute over Pacific Asia, and America as a Pacific power, which is really how America became a superpower.
Yeah, but Parag,
Spanish-American War.
Take 5G, Huawei. Should America try to prevent foreign investment or the localization in China.
Right.
And I'm sure they would do the strong pressure to Europe to follow SWIFT. So
they already are. But you know that the Obama administration tried to convince every European government not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You rejected America then, and you joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Lots of countries, including your own neighbors, tried to convince you not to join the Belt and Road, but you did it anyway. So you've been acting in your own interest.
But the climate was different. You cannot compare the quality of the relationship between China and the United States and in the Obama era, the one you mentioned, and what's going on now. Okay, this is an electoral year, but I don't think a lot will change with Biden, should Biden win. So I think this kind of tense relationship is here to stay for all the reasons you have been explaining in the first part of your presentation. So
I have no doubt that U.S.-China tensions will persist in perpetuity. I am asking, or my contention is that that does not mean that the whole rest of the planet Earth has to choose one side or the other, because that's not the way it's playing out. What every country is doing what is in its own best interest, not choosing one side or the other. So in some areas you agree that you will screen Chinese investments and not allow majority ownership by Chinese entities into sensitive sectors or mergers and acquisitions into those sectors. But in other areas, you will work with Huawei, you will work with Chinese institutions, and you will continue to pursue free trade agreements with India, with ASEAN, with Korea, with Vietnam, with Japan, whereas America is not doing those things. So you can pick areas of cooperation, but that does not mean that you are following America. It's in your best interest to do these things, right? And I think that when it comes to 5G, it's not that a choice between America and China, because America doesn't have 5G, right? America is actually helping Europe be the leader. What's not to like about that? You know, it's something that Europe should be doing anyway. Nokia, Ericsson, and so forth are now getting more and more contracts. So I think that the things that are happening right now, actually, rather than portray Europe as being trapped, I think that Europe should have much more confidence and be very opportunistic about these kinds of situations.
We will do our best. It's a promise. The last two questions, Parag. Thank you for your time. You have been extremely generous in touching so many different issues. The first question has to do with popular demonstration. Despite the pandemic, protest movements are still taking place in some countries, many countries around the world, and often on shared issues. How do you assess the implication of a potential globalized protest movement on the future of international relations? Right now, we don't see, we have to be honest, that many protests after the coronavirus. We saw them December and January, but with the unlock of our society, they will come back for sure, because there will be many other social and economic issues to bring people into the street. Do you see any possibility of joining up, linking this movement, and with which implication on the future of international relations?
Well, to be honest, I do believe that this is a systemic global issue. It has its origins basically in the financial capitalism and deregulation and, excessive growth and inequality dating back to the 1990s. But particularly when it comes to the global underclass revolt, that you can see physically from the mid-2000s. You had the financial crisis, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring. You've had the protests against police brutality. You've had the underclass migrant situation in Europe as well. Through the 2000s, the unrest across the Middle East, Latin America, food price spikes causing riots. This has all been a persistent feature of our global landscape, particularly driven by youth, as a global youth, millennial and Generation Z cohorts develop and gain their own voice for now I would say 12 years. We are 12 years into a global underclass revolt. And if you did not have this pandemic, it would already be in flames even more. Look at Chile, look at Paris, look at Beirut, look at Baghdad. So you're absolutely right that as soon as we have a vaccine, we'll have more violence out on the streets. The only solution to it is, of course, more accountable, more responsive governance. We are not destined to be failed states, corrupt states, inefficient governments, non-utilitarian, elite-driven, kleptocratic. These are not inevitable features of human life, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have New Zealand and Denmark and Canada and Germany and Japan, right? So these countries where they are not learning from failure, not learning from their mistakes and experiences, not learning lessons from their neighbors that are doing things better, those governments will fall. And, sitting as I am in probably the world's best run country, I have to say that, every country gets the government that it deserves to some degree. But you have to look at the silver lining, because I've been spending time in Chile. I went to Chile twice.
Please tell everybody that you are not right now in the States, but you are in Singapore.
Yes,
because they may think that you are saying that you are in the best run country, because you have said you are American, you are Indian, you are from Singapore, you are everywhere and every nationality. Parag is now in Singapore, and he's saying that Singapore is one of the best run countries in the world. Yeah. And there is the last question for you on Singapore. So this is the end of our conversation. Someone is asking, Singapore is a neutral country. What is the role of neutrality in the future world? 1 minute.
Sure. Well, the word neutrality connotes having, hands-off relations. That's not true. I don't believe that any country is actually neutral anymore. I believe what most countries are doing, including Singapore, is practicing what I call multi-alignment. It's not just a deferential relationship with the United States. Singapore's relationship with the United States is extremely active, intense, and strategic, including militarily. It also has very intense relations with China. It has deepening ties with India. It has a free trade agreement with Europe. It has enormously deep ties with Japan and Australia. That's multi-alignment, and smart countries.
That's free riding. That's free riding.
No, free riding is a bit different, because actually Singapore, given its economic gravity, is a provider of public goods, of resources, of investment, and a conduit that for capital that would otherwise have a hard time knowing how to be allocated in the region. Singapore is the #1 channel of foreign investment into all of Southeast Asia, even though it's so tiny you can't even see it. So Singapore is a public goods provider despite its tiny size. However, just to close the point, all countries today, if you're smart, are practicing this multi-alignment. Don't choose sides. Never, ever choose sides. Let us conclude on this point. Never choose sides. Always maintain the best, robust relationships in all directions.
In Europe, historically, Italy has always been criticized for not choosing sides. So this for the Italian, those following this dialogue are not Italians, but for the Italian listening to this is the best conclusion of this wonderful conversation we had. Parag, thank you very much. Good luck for our work. Good luck for your books. And thank you for sharing your thoughts. It has been a real pleasure.
Grazie, Paolo. Very nice to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.